Her body was found inside the cabin of a yacht, injuries so severe detectives could barely understand what had been done to her. The smell of salt water mixed with something far more disturbing filled the morning air as investigators arrived at the marina. What started as a romantic evening aboard a luxury yacht had transformed into one of the most brutal crime scenes Florida had witnessed in years. Margaret Thompson was 51 years old, recently divorced, and desperate for a fresh start. She had met someone new, someone exciting who promised her adventure beyond the quiet suburban life she'd grown tired of. The yacht party was supposed to be her escape, a chance to feel alive again after years of feeling invisible. But when morning came, Margaret would never see another sunrise. The man she trusted most? He had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a scene that would haunt investigators for months to come. Tonight, we uncover the truth behind what really happened on that yacht and why a woman's search for love became her final mistake. Before we continue deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 questions would consume investigators as they piece together the events of that fatal night. First, who was this mysterious man Margaret had met just weeks before, and why had she trusted him so completely? Second, what really happened below deck on that yacht while the party continued above? And third, was this a tragic accident that went too far, or something far more calculated and cruel? These questions would lead detectives down a path they never expected, uncovering a web of deception that reached far beyond a single night on the water. The answers would shock Margaret's family, terrify her friends, and leave investigators wondering how many other women had crossed paths with the same charming stranger who seemed to vanish like smoke whenever danger arose. As we reconstruct the final hours of Margaret Thompson's life, ask yourself this: have you ever trusted someone too quickly, ignored the warning signs because you wanted to believe in something better? Margaret's story is a reminder that sometimes the people who seem most perfect are hiding the darkest secrets of all. Margaret Thompson had spent 25 years in a marriage that slowly drained the life from her soul. When her divorce was finalized 6 months earlier, her closest friends barely recognized the woman who emerged. Gone was the quiet housewife who always put everyone else's needs first. In her place stood someone determined to make up for lost time, to experience everything she'd missed during her years of playing it safe. She started going out more, joining her friend Sarah for drinks at the marina bars in Fort Lauderdale. Sarah would later tell investigators that Margaret seemed like a teenager discovering freedom for the first time. She was glowing, Sarah remembered. For the first time in decades, Maggie was truly happy. She kept saying she felt like she was finally living her real life. That's when Margaret met Jake Harrison, a 32-year-old bartender at the Sunset Marina who seemed to embody everything her ex-husband wasn't. Where her former marriage had been predictable and suffocating, Jake was spontaneous and exciting. He worked on yachts during the day and tended bar at night, living a lifestyle that seemed impossibly glamorous to a woman who had spent most of her adult life in the suburbs. Jake was the kind of man who could make any woman feel special. He had deep blue eyes that seemed to look straight into your soul, and a way of talking that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He told Margaret stories about sailing to the Bahamas, about sunrise breakfasts on the deck of million-dollar yachts, about a life lived without rules or limitations. Margaret's friends weren't as impressed. Sarah noticed how Jake's eyes would wander when other women walked by, how he seemed to have a rehearsed answer for every question about his past. "There was something about him that didn't sit right with me," Sarah would later testify. "He was too smooth, too perfect. Real people have flaws, rough edges. Jake was like he'd been designed in a lab to be exactly what lonely women wanted to hear." But Margaret was in no mood to listen to warnings. For the first time in years, she felt desired, adventurous, alive. When Jake mentioned that he had access to a friend's yacht and suggested they host a small party, Margaret didn't hesitate to say yes. She even offered to help pay for food and drinks, eager to impress this man who had awakened something in her she thought was dead forever. The night before the party, Margaret called her sister Rachel in Michigan. "I know you think I'm being crazy," Margaret said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "But Rachel, I feel like I'm 25 again. Jake makes me feel beautiful, makes me feel like I matter. I know it's fast, but when you've been married to someone who made you feel invisible for 25 years, fast doesn't feel fast enough." Rachel would replay that conversation in her mind 1,000 times afterward, wondering if she should have pressed harder, should have gotten on a plane to Florida to see this Jake person for herself. But at the time, she was just happy to hear her sister sound so alive, so full of hope after years of going through the motions of a life that had stopped bringing her joy. Despite the warnings from her friends, she agreed to meet him again, this time on a yacht. The yacht was a 42-foot Meridian anchored at a private slip in one of Fort Lauderdale's most exclusive marinas. Jake had convinced Margaret that his friend David, supposedly a successful real estate developer, had loaned them the boat for the evening. What Margaret didn't know was that Jake had simply taken note of which boats had been sitting unused for weeks, and had become expert at bypassing basic security systems. Margaret arrived at 7 p.m. wearing a new dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, a flowing blue number that made her feel elegant and confident. She brought 2 bottles of expensive wine and a homemade spinach dip that had always been a hit at her suburban dinner parties. Jake greeted her with a kiss that lasted just long enough to make her feel dizzy, and for a moment, all of Sarah's warnings seemed ridiculous. The other guests began arriving shortly after. There was Crystal, a 20-something blonde who Jake introduced as another bartender from the marina, though she seemed to know nothing about mixing drinks. There was Tony, who claimed to be a yacht broker, but spent most of the evening asking oddly specific questions about Margaret's divorce settlement and financial situation. And there was Marcus, quiet and intense, who Jake said was a photographer, but who never took his camera out of its bag. As the sun set over the intracoastal waterway, the party took on the dreamy quality Margaret had imagined. The wine flowed freely, the conversation was light and flirtatious, and the gentle rocking of the boat made everything feel like a beautiful dream. Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in months, feeling sophisticated and worldly in a way that her suburban life had never allowed. But as the evening progressed, subtle things began to feel wrong. Crystal kept disappearing below deck to make phone calls, always returning with a strange smile that didn't reach her eyes. Tony's questions about Margaret's finances became more direct, less casual, and Marcus spent most of the evening watching Margaret with an intensity that made her skin crawl whenever she caught his gaze. When Margaret mentioned feeling uncomfortable around 10 p.m., Jake was quick to suggest they go below deck where it was quieter. He poured her another glass of wine, this one tasting slightly different than the others, with a bitter aftertaste that she mentioned to Jake. He laughed it off, saying the bottle must have gotten too warm in the sun. The last thing Margaret remembered clearly was Jake leading her to the boat's main cabin, his arm around her waist, whispering something about showing her something special he'd brought just for her. The party upstairs continued, music and laughter creating a soundtrack that would mask whatever happened next. Hours later, when the party upstairs had died down and the other guests had quietly slipped away, the screams no one could hear had already stopped forever. By morning she was found, and the man was gone. If you're still with me, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's watching closely, because what we're about to uncover next will change everything you thought you knew about this case. At 6 a.m., Marina security guard Robert Chen made the discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. During his routine morning patrol, he noticed that the usually pristine yacht had its cabin door standing open, unusual for the typically security-conscious boat owners in this section of the marina. When he called out and received no response, Chen climbed aboard to investigate. The scene inside the cabin was unlike anything the 20-year security veteran had ever encountered. Margaret Thompson's body was found in a position that suggested she had tried to fight back, her hands showing defensive wounds that told a story of terror and desperation. The cabin itself bore signs of a violent struggle, with furniture overturned and personal belongings scattered across the floor. Detective Maria Santos arrived on scene 45 minutes later and immediately called for additional units and the medical examiner. "In my 15 years working homicide, I'd never seen anything like it," Santos would later testify. "This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was something calculated, something that had been planned." The investigation revealed troubling details about the previous night's events. Neighbors on nearby boats reported hearing what sounded like a party until around 11 p.m., followed by an unusual quiet that lasted until dawn. Several witnesses mentioned seeing people leaving the yacht between midnight and 2 a.m., but in the darkness and marina lighting, none could provide detailed descriptions. More disturbing was what investigators found below deck. Hidden in a storage compartment, they discovered what appeared to be a homemade device unlike anything the forensics team had seen before. The device seemed designed to cause maximum physical trauma, and its presence suggested this was not Margaret's first encounter with such equipment, though she may not have known what she was agreeing to. The marina's security cameras provided crucial evidence, but also raised more questions. The footage showed Margaret arriving alone at 7 p.m., looking happy and excited. It captured Jake arriving separately 20 minutes later, carrying a large duffel bag that he hadn't mentioned to Margaret. The other guests arrived in pairs, all seeming to know each other despite Jake's introduction of them as casual acquaintances. Most chilling was the final piece of footage, time-stamped at 3:47 a.m. It showed Jake leaving the yacht alone, no longer carrying the duffel bag, walking calmly toward the parking area where the cameras couldn't follow. His body language showed none of the panic or distress you'd expect from someone who had just discovered a friend's body. Instead, he moved with the purposeful stride of someone completing a planned task. Detective Santos immediately issued a BOLO alert for Jake Harrison, but when they ran his identification through the system, they discovered something that sent chills through the entire investigation team. The Jake Harrison that Margaret thought she knew didn't exist. The social security number was fake, the address he'd given was a vacant lot, and the phone number went to a burner cell that had been turned off immediately after the party. Even more disturbing was what they discovered when they interviewed the marina staff. None of them had ever seen Jake working as a bartender, despite his claims of being employed there. The manager confirmed that no one matching his description had ever been on their payroll, and security footage from the previous months showed him visiting the marina frequently, always alone, always watching the patterns of boat owners and security guards with the focused attention of someone planning something. As the investigation expanded, a pattern began to emerge that made Margaret's murder seem less like an isolated incident and more like the culmination of a carefully planned operation. The other party guests had all disappeared as completely as Jake, leaving behind false names and fake contact information. But then, investigators discovered something chilling: a homemade device left behind. The device found hidden in the yacht's storage compartment would become the key to understanding not just what happened to Margaret Thompson, but who Jake Harrison really was. Forensics experts determined that the equipment was designed specifically to cause the type of injuries Margaret had sustained, but its sophisticated construction suggested someone with advanced technical knowledge and, disturbingly, previous experience. When investigators tested the device, they discovered something that changed the entire direction of the case. The equipment contained biological evidence from multiple victims, including DNA that didn't match Margaret. This wasn't Jake's first time using this particular method, and Margaret wasn't his first victim. A breakthrough came when Detective Santos received a call from the FBI. The device's unique construction matched evidence from 3 unsolved murders across Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina, all involving women who had met charming strangers in marina bars and coastal towns. The pattern was always the same: recently divorced women, financially stable, looking for adventure after years of conventional marriages. The FBI profile painted a picture of a predator who specifically targeted women in Margaret's demographic because they were vulnerable in ways that made them perfect victims. These women had often been isolated in unhappy marriages, had limited experience with modern dating, and were desperate to prove to themselves that they could still be desirable. They were also likely to have divorce settlements or savings that made them financially attractive targets. But the true horror of Jake's operation became clear when investigators discovered his real identity. The man Margaret knew as Jake Harrison was actually Robert Kyle Morrison, a 38-year-old with a criminal history spanning back 15 years. Morrison had served time for assault, fraud, and sexual battery, but had been released 18 months earlier due to prison overcrowding. Morrison's method was sickeningly systematic. He would spend weeks in coastal towns, identifying recently divorced women through public records and social media. He'd establish a pattern at local marina bars, becoming a familiar face before targeting specific victims. His fake persona as a yacht worker gave him access to boats and knowledge of marina security patterns that he used to carry out his crimes. Even more chilling was what investigators discovered in Morrison's abandoned apartment in Miami. The walls were covered with photographs of potential victims, including several photos of Margaret taken without her knowledge during their early meetings. There were detailed notes about each woman's financial situation, personal vulnerabilities, and social connections. Margaret's file was the thickest, suggesting Morrison had been planning her murder for weeks before they ever met. The apartment also contained equipment for creating false identities, sophisticated camera gear for surveillance, and most disturbing of all, trophies from previous victims. Among these trophies was Margaret's wedding ring, which she had continued wearing on her right hand as a reminder of her strength in leaving her marriage. In the courtroom 3 months later, prosecutors would present evidence that Morrison had been operating his deadly scheme across the southeastern United States for over 2 years. The prosecution estimated that he had murdered at least 7 women, though they suspected the actual number was higher. Margaret Thompson hadn't just been randomly targeted. She had been methodically selected, studied, and then executed according to a plan that Morrison had perfected through years of practice. What was presented as a romantic night had now been revealed as calculated cruelty on a scale that shocked even experienced homicide investigators. The manhunt for Robert Kyle Morrison became one of the largest joint operations between Florida law enforcement and the FBI in recent history. But as investigators would soon discover, Morrison had vanished as completely as if he had never existed, using skills developed over years of creating and abandoning false identities. The shocking revelation came when FBI analysts traced Morrison's movements in the days following Margaret's murder. Security footage from Miami International Airport showed a man matching Morrison's description boarding a flight to Mexico City just 18 hours after leaving the yacht. From there, the trail went cold, but federal investigators suspected Morrison had connections to criminal networks in Central America that specialized in helping fugitives disappear permanently. What made the investigation even more frustrating was the discovery that Morrison had been planning his escape route long before he ever met Margaret. The abandoned apartment in Miami had been paid for 6 months in advance under another false identity, and investigators found evidence that Morrison had established multiple safe houses across Florida and neighboring states. He had been preparing for the possibility of having to run, which suggested a level of premeditation that made Margaret's murder seem even more coldly calculated. Margaret's family struggled to understand how their loved one had become entangled with such a dangerous predator. Her sister Rachel flew down from Michigan to identify the body, and was haunted by the contrast between the excited, hopeful woman she had spoken to just days earlier and the crime scene photos that would forever change how she remembered her sister. Margaret thought she was finally living, Rachel said through tears at a press conference 6 months later. She thought she had found someone who saw her as beautiful and adventurous. Instead, she found a monster who saw her as prey. The hardest part is knowing that her search for happiness is what led her to him. The case took on national attention when other families began reaching out to investigators, sharing stories of loved ones who had disappeared under similar circumstances. The FBI eventually linked Morrison to 9 confirmed murders and suspected him in at least 6 more disappearances of women who fit Margaret's profile perfectly. Perhaps most disturbing was what investigators learned about Morrison's psychology from criminal profilers. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had interviewed Morrison during his previous incarceration, described him as a textbook example of an organized killer who specifically targeted women experiencing major life transitions. These women weren't random victims, Dr. Walsh explained. They were chosen because their emotional state made them vulnerable to his manipulation, and their life circumstances made them less likely to be immediately missed if they disappeared. The realization that Morrison was still out there, potentially targeting other vulnerable women, led to an unprecedented public awareness campaign. Law enforcement agencies across the southeastern United States distributed Morrison's photo and warned recently divorced women to be especially cautious when meeting new romantic partners in marina towns and coastal areas. But despite the massive investigation and international cooperation, Morrison remained a ghost. Some investigators believed he had assumed a completely new identity and was continuing his deadly pattern in another country. Others suspected he had been killed by criminal associates who wanted to eliminate a liability. The truth was that a predator who had perfected the art of disappearing had once again vanished without a trace. Margaret Thompson's murder would never be officially solved, and her family would never get the closure they desperately needed. The man who had taken her life had also stolen their chance for justice, leaving behind only questions and the terrible knowledge that somewhere he might be charming another lonely woman with promises of adventure and romance. She only wanted love, but instead she became a victim of deception and violence that reached far beyond anything her quiet suburban life had prepared her to recognize. As we reach the end of Margaret Thompson's story, we're left with questions that investigators may never be able to answer. Was Morrison's disappearance a carefully planned escape, or did his criminal associates decide he had become too much of a liability? Is he still out there, charming vulnerable women in marina bars across Latin America, or did his deadly career finally catch up with him in ways we'll never know? But perhaps the most important question is one that each of us must answer for ourselves. How well do we really know the people we let into our lives? Margaret Thompson was an intelligent, educated woman who simply wanted to experience life after years of feeling invisible in her marriage. Her desire for adventure and romance made her the perfect target for a predator who had spent years perfecting his ability to become exactly what lonely women wanted to see. Take a moment to think about Margaret's story and ask yourself, have you ever ignored warning signs because you wanted to believe in something better? Have you ever trusted someone quickly because they seemed to offer everything you felt was missing from your life? Margaret's friends saw the red flags, but Margaret herself was too caught up in the excitement of feeling desired again to listen to their concerns. Do you believe this was a tragic accident that went too far, or premeditated murder carried out by a serial killer who had perfected his deadly craft? More importantly, how can we protect ourselves and the people we love from predators who are skilled at becoming exactly what we want them to be? What do you think really happened that night on the yacht? Was justice truly served, or is the killer still out there? Comment your thoughts below because we read everyone, and your insights might help other viewers recognize similar warning signs in their own lives. And if you thought this case was shocking, wait until you hear about the Florida man who put his wife in a freezer for 5 days, and she survived. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next, because the stories we uncover are reminders that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the most perfect. Remember, Margaret Thompson's story isn't just about one woman's tragic end. It's a warning about how predators operate and how quickly a search for love can become a deadly trap. Stay safe, trust your instincts, and never ignore the warnings from people who care about you. Sometimes those uncomfortable conversations with friends might just save your life.